Throughout most of the last century, purchasing a home typically required about 3 years of a family's earnings. 3 years of work could secure shelter, and this was simply the standard expectation. Obviously, that's transformed dramatically. Research examining 95 major metropolitan areas worldwide discovered that absolutely none qualify as affordable by traditional standards anymore. Even cities previously considered reasonably priced have become financially inaccessible. Throughout these urban centers, homes now cost over 5 times typical household earnings on average, and in locations like Hong Kong, Sydney, and Vancouver, that figure isn't 5, it's 9 or even 14 times annual income. These aren't even the most extreme cases. In Beijing and Shanghai, price-to-income measurements regularly surpass 20 or even 30 times, demonstrating how dramatically the disconnect can expand in the world's most stressed housing markets. The verdict is clear. Homeownership dreams are fading, and not in isolated locations but globally. When that aspiration vanishes, numerous other consequences follow. As residential properties transform into investment vehicles rather than living spaces, individuals postpone starting families because adequate space remains unaffordable. They reject superior employment opportunities because relocation costs prove prohibitive, and younger demographics abandon saving entirely, questioning the purpose of accumulating funds for something perpetually beyond reach. This transformation creates an unusual economic situation where individuals who construct our urban infrastructure, educate our children, and maintain essential services cannot afford residing in the communities they sustain. How do we arrive at this predicament? If populations cannot afford populating these metropolitan areas, can pricing deteriorate further? Finally, what would genuinely be required to resolve this? Have you experienced starting an email to a business contact or teammate and struggled finding your opening? Between composing scripts, correspondence, and coordinating with collaborators, writing dominates my workday. Beginning often presents the greatest challenge. That's why Grammarly has become invaluable. It's an AI writing companion supporting professionals with all writing requirements from conception to completion, offering customized recommendations that match your voice. I've utilized their AI chat feature to overcome writer's block and transition directly into productive writing. It includes a humanizer function that makes your writing sound more authentic by adding warmth and creating more natural phrasing. Beyond that, it can analyze your writing and deliver subject-specific feedback through its expert review capability, which applies feedback modeled after field specialists to enhance your writing quality. Another impressive feature is downloading Grammarly on your mobile device and composing those urgent team emails while traveling. If you want to enhance your writing and creative thinking, whether for professional work, personal projects, or simply clearer communication, register and upgrade to Grammarly Pro to amplify your productivity. You can access my link for 20% off Pro. Thanks again to Grammarly for supporting this video. Annually, Chapman University publishes the Demographia International Housing Affordability Report, among the most comprehensive examinations of living expenses available. It evaluates home prices against household earnings across 95 metropolitan areas like Sydney, Toronto, London, and San Francisco, revealing where home ownership aspirations remain viable and where they've completely evaporated. Analysts employ something called the median multiple, the typical home price divided by typical household annual earnings. In functioning markets, that figure hovers around 3. This year, something remarkable occurred. For the first time throughout the report's 21-year existence, not one market qualified as affordable. While circumstances differ, most of the 95 metropolitan areas now classify as seriously or severely unaffordable, meaning typical homes cost over 4 to 5 times typical household earnings. In 12 locations, conditions have deteriorated so severely they introduced a new classification, impossibly unaffordable, where median homes cost over 9 times median earnings. Heading this list is Hong Kong at 14.4 times income, with Sydney close behind at 13.8. Following are San Jose, Vancouver, and Los Angeles. When you examine beyond these metropolitan areas, you recognize identical patterns repeating across entire nations. Homes in Australia's average metropolitan area now approach 10 times median earnings. Even smaller markets like Perth or Brisbane have become less affordable than New York. In Canada, affordability has been deteriorating since the mid-2000s. Vancouver has maintained position among the 4th least affordable metropolitan areas globally for 18 consecutive years, with Toronto following closely. Greater London homes currently sit at 9 times median earnings, while the UK average has risen to 5.6, approximately double what existed in the 1990s. Even the United States, historically recognized for its extensive suburbs and lower housing costs, has climbed from 3.9 before the pandemic to 4.8 currently. For perspective, Pittsburgh, the most affordable metropolitan area on the list, registers at 3.2. That represented normalcy previously. Now it's exceptional. Just 3 decades ago, nearly all these metropolitan areas were affordable. Home values increased roughly parallel with earnings, but currently they've completely separated. The report's researchers describe this as an existential threat to middle-income households, and no expertise is necessary to understand why. When home values escalate faster than compensation, impacts extend well beyond housing markets. Families postpone having children. Workers decline superior positions because relocation remains unaffordable, and younger generations lose access to what previously represented middle-class foundations, owning property. This prompts the larger question: if this wasn't problematic 3 decades ago, what transformed? 3 decades ago, a residence was shelter. It was fundamental necessity. Currently, it's integrated into global investment frameworks. This transcends housing alone. Throughout recent decades, virtually everything qualifying as an asset has dramatically increased in value. Not just residential properties, but land, equities, and even artwork. Why? Because wealthy individuals, corporations, and large investment funds possess more capital than ever, and they all seek secure placement. When wealthy individuals acquire more money, they don't purchase more consumables. They acquire assets. Housing suffered the greatest impact because it's simultaneously essential and among the most accessible assets to own, lease, or leverage. It became the optimal target. This artificially elevated demand while simultaneously we were arbitrarily constraining supply. It commenced with worthy intentions, safeguarding green spaces, managing sprawl, maintaining neighborhood identity. Over time, though, those worthy intentions evolved into zoning restrictions, height limitations, parking requirements, endless approval processes, all slowing construction and elevating developable land costs. As those constraints tightened, housing ceased behaving like typical markets. Values no longer reflected construction material and labor expenses. They reflected policy-created scarcity. As interest rates declined and global capital supplies expanded, more capital pursued the identical limited housing inventory. Investors, funds, and even retirement systems recognized that real estate provided consistent returns and inflation protection. If you could borrow at 3% while your property appreciated 7% annually, residency wasn't necessary. Ownership was sufficient. This transformation converted homes into financial instruments. Institutional purchasers began acquiring single-family residences in volume. Foreign investors utilized property as wealth repositories, and even typical households began perceiving real estate as perpetually appreciating. That capital wave flowed directly into metropolitan areas already topping demography's rankings, where limited supply propelled values skyward. In such markets, the more valuable housing became, the more capital it attracted, generating a reinforcing cycle between scarcity and speculation. Meanwhile, compensation stopped maintaining pace. Throughout most of the last century, earnings and home values moved together. As workers became more efficient, they earned more, and as metropolitan areas expanded, they added more residences. During the 1990s, though, those trajectories separated. Trade, automation, and offshore production constrained middle-income wage expansion, even as living expenses increased. In the U.S., median inflation-adjusted wages have increased only around 10% throughout the last 20 years, while home values have doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled during the identical period. Several decades ago, one income could purchase a family residence, and if a second earner entered the workforce, that enabled a larger residence or superior neighborhood. Once everyone had dual incomes, though, sellers recognized it and values climbed correspondingly. Rather than making residences more accessible, dual incomes simply made identical residences cost twice as much. As values increased faster than compensation, something else occurred. Individuals extended further into debt. Individuals would allocate more of their earnings toward a mortgage. Banks continued lending because increasing values made markets appear secure. And every time lenders approved larger loans, purchasers could bid higher, elevating values again. It generated a reinforcing cycle that perpetuated itself. Then the pandemic arrived and the entire system began destabilizing. Remote employment scattered demand into smaller metropolitan areas, but didn't resolve the fundamental problem. Construction expenses exploded, supply networks fractured, inflation sent material costs soaring, and workforce shortages delayed projects everywhere. When interest rates finally increased, borrowing became expensive, but values didn't collapse because nobody wanted to sell. Millions of homeowners were secured into ultra-low-rate mortgages and refused relocating, so supply froze. Governments attempted assistance, but primarily incorrectly. They introduced additional tax benefits, grants, and subsidies to first-home purchasers. The challenge is that when you cannot construct more residences, providing people more money doesn't reduce values. It simply makes purchasers compete harder over identical ones. If you trace it backward, the answer to what transformed isn't one element, it's a cascading reaction. We restricted land, we flooded the system with inexpensive capital, we permitted compensation to stagnate while asset values accelerated, and when the foundations of that entire system began fracturing, we intensified with temporary solutions, accumulating layers on top and simply hoping gravity would cooperate. That's how we arrived at impossibly unaffordable residences and why currently. The world's wealthiest metropolitan areas now head the rankings of the least affordable locations globally. What does that genuinely mean for populations residing in them? For millions of middle-income families, it means homeownership no longer factors into planning. In metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, Sydney, and New York, a substantial proportion of renters now allocate approximately 30 to 35% of their earnings merely maintaining shelter, just above the threshold economists consider unaffordable. The average first-time homebuyer currently exists in their late 30s or early 40s, a complete decade older than their parents were, and when populations cannot afford residing where their employment exists, they cease relocating for opportunity. In the US and Canada, populations are departing major metropolitan areas for smaller communities, a phenomenon economists label counter-urbanization. While that might appear beneficial for regional expansion, it frequently means the most productive metropolitan areas lose the specific workers that maintain their operation. Educators, medical professionals, skilled trades, hospitality personnel. A restricted housing market becomes a restricted employment market. Productivity declines, innovation spreads more gradually, and inequality intensifies. Because while renters and first-time homebuyers fall behind, existing homeowners continue accumulating wealth. Annually, their residences gain value, not because they worked additional hours or created something novel, but because scarcity made their property more valuable. Globally, real estate total value currently sits at approximately 3.5 times the world's annual GDP, even for individuals. Fortunate enough to access the market, purchasing at such elevated values feels like speculation. High debt, high risk, and constant concern that one economic disruption could destabilize everything. Can this be stopped? Some nations are beginning attempts. New Zealand launched a plan called Going for Housing Growth in 2023, which requires major municipal councils to zone sufficient land for 30 years of housing demand. Their objective is straightforward. Make land supply predictable so values cannot spiral uncontrollably. In the U.S., metropolitan areas like Minneapolis and states like California have begun relaxing single-family zoning. That means duplexes and small residential buildings can be constructed in neighborhoods that previously permitted only one residence per lot. This expands supply where populations actually desire residing. Singapore is implementing a completely different strategy. There, nearly 90% of households own their residences, thanks to extensive public housing programs managed by the Housing and Development Board. The government acquires land, constructs at scale, and sells apartments directly to citizens at subsidized values. This demonstrates that if you treat housing as infrastructure, like transportation or education, you can achieve near-universal ownership. Then there are nations addressing speculation rather than supply. Hong Kong and Wales both heavily tax second residences. In Wales, local councils can impose up to 300% council tax premium. Taiwan taxes properties sold within 2 years at up to 45%, discouraging rapid transactions and speculative purchasing. In the Netherlands, some municipalities have prohibited investors from purchasing in certain neighborhoods to preserve residences for locals. The U.S. is currently exploring a comparable concept with the End Hedge Fund Control of American Homes Act. This legislation, would prevent hedge funds and other large real estate firms from owning single-family residences altogether. To resolve this crisis, we need more residences. We also need to reconsider who's purchasing them, where they're constructed, and what kind of economy they're generating. Because fundamentally, it's the familiar pattern. A massive wave of capital flowing into a handful of assets and overwhelming the middle and low-income populations in the process. Unless that imbalance transforms, no quantity of zoning reform or new construction will make residences genuinely affordable. If you want to comprehend why inequality is currently reaching a critical threshold and how we arrived here, we've already created an entire video on that precise subject, and you should be able to click that on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.